Chapter 3 of The Best Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Gail Mattern. The Best Man by Grace Livingston Hill. Chapter 3. Almost in front of the house stood a closed carriage with two fine horses, but the coachman was looking up anxiously toward the next building. The sound of the closing door drew the man's attention, and catching Gordon's eye, he made as if to jump down and throw open the door of the carriage. Quick as a flash, Gordon saw he had been mistaken for the man the carriage awaited, and he determined to make use of the circumstance. "Don't get down," he called to the man, taking chances. "It's very late already. I'll open the door. Drive for all you're worth." He jumped in and slammed the carriage door behind him, and in a second more the horses were flying down the street. A glance from the back window showed an excited group of his fellow guests standing at the open door of the mansion he had just left, pointing toward his carriage and wildly gesticulating. He surmised that his host was already at the telephone, calling for his own private detective. Gordon could scarcely believe his senses that he had accomplished his mission in flight so far, and yet he knew his situation was most precarious. Where he was going he neither knew nor cared. When he was sure he was far enough from the house, he would call to the driver and give him directions. But first he must make sure that the precious paper was safely stowed away, in case he should be caught and searched. They might be coming after him with motorcycles in a minute or two. Carefully rolling the paper into a tiny compass, he slipped it into a hollow gold case, which was among the things in the envelope the chief had given him. There was a fine chain attached to the case, and the whole looked innocently like a gold pencil. The chain he slipped about his neck, dropping the case down inside his collar. That done, he breathed more freely. Only from his dead body should they take that away. Then he hastily put on the false eyebrows, mustache, and goatee which had been provided for his disguise, and pulling on a pair of light gloves, he felt more fit to evade detection. He was just beginning to think what he should say to the driver about taking him to the station, for it was important that he get out of the city at once, when glancing out of the window to see what part of the city he was being taken through, he became aware of an auto close beside the carriage, keeping pace with it, and two men stretching their necks as if to look into the carriage window at him. He withdrew to the shadow instantly so that they could not see him, but the one quick glance he had made him sure that one of his pursuers was the short, thick-set man with the cruel jaw who had sat across from him at the dinner table a few minutes before. If this were so, he had practically no chance at all of escape, for what was a carriage against a swift-moving car, and what was he against a whole city full of strangers and enemies? If he attempted to drop from the carriage on the other side and escape into the darkness, he had but a chance of 1,000 at not being seen, and he could not hope to hide and get away in this unknown part of the city. Yet he must take his chance somehow, for the carriage must sooner or later get somewhere and be obliged to face his pursuers. To make matters worse, just at the instant when he had decided to jump at the next dark place and was measuring the distance with his eye, his hand even being outstretched to grasp the door handle, a blustering, boisterous motorcycle burst into full bloom just where he intended to jump, and the man who rode it was in uniform. He dodged back into the darkness of the carriage again that he might not be seen, and the motorcycle came so near that its rider turned a white face and looked in. He felt that his time had come, and his cause was lost. It had not yet occurred to him that the men who were pursuing him would hardly be likely to call in municipal aid in their search, lest their own duplicity would be discovered. He reasoned that he was dealing with desperate men who would stop at nothing to get back the original cipher paper and stop his mouth. He was well aware that only death would be considered a sufficient silencer for him after what he had seen at Mr. Holman's dinner table, for the evidence he could give would involve the honor of every man who had sat there. He saw in a flash that the two henchmen, whom he was sure were even now riding in the car on his right, had been at the table for the purpose of silencing him if he showed any signs of giving trouble. The wonder was that any of them dared call in a stranger on a matter of such grave import, which meant ruin to them all if they were found out. but probably they had reasoned that every man had his price and had intended to offer him a share of the booty. It was likely that the chief had caused it to be understood by them that he was the right kind of man for their purpose. Yet, of course, they had taken precautions, and now they had him well caught, an auto on one side, a motorcycle on the other, and no telling how many more behind. He had been a fool to get into this carriage. He might have known it would only trap him to his death. There seemed absolutely no chance for escape now, yet he must fight to the last. He put his hand on his revolver to make sure it was easy to get at, tried to think whether it would not be better to chew up and swallow that cipher message rather than to run the risk of its falling again into the hands of the enemy, decided that he must carry it intact to his chief if possible, and finally that he must make a dash for safety at once, when just then the carriage turned briskly into a wide driveway, and the attendant auto and motorcycle dropped behind as if puzzled at the move. The carriage stopped short, and a bright light from an open doorway was flung into his face. There seemed to be high stone walls on one side, and the lighted doorway on the other hand evidently led into a great stone building. He could hear the puffing of the car and cycle just behind. A wild notion that the carriage had been placed in front of the house to trap him in case he tried to escape, and that he had been brought to prison, flitted through his mind. His hand was on his revolver as the coachman jumped down to fling open the carriage door, for he intended to fight for his liberty to the last. He glanced back through the carriage window, and the lights of the auto glared in his face. The short, thick-set man was getting out of the car, and the motorcyclist had stood his machine up against the wall and was coming toward the carriage. Escape was going to be practically impossible. A wild thought of dashing out the opposite door of his carriage, boldly seizing the motorcycle and making off on it, passed through his mind. And then the door on his left was flung open, and the carriage was immediately surrounded by 6 excited men in evening dress, all talking at once. "Here you are at last," they chorused. "Where is the best man?" shouted someone from the doorway. "Hasn't he come either?" And, as if in answer, one of the men by the carriage door wheeled and called excitedly, "Yes, he's come. Tell him. Tell Jeff. Tell him he's come." Then turning once more to Gordon, he seized him by the arm and cried, "Come on, quickly. There isn't a minute to wait. The organist is fairly frantic. Everybody has been just as nervous as could be. We couldn't very well go on without you, you know. But don't let that worry you. It's all right now you've come. Forget it, old man, and hustle." Dimly Gordon perceived above the sound of subdued hubbub that an organ was playing, and even as he listened it burst into the joyous notes of the wedding march. It dawned upon him that this was not a prison to which he had come, but a church. Not a courtroom, but a wedding. And horror of horrors, they took him for the best man. His disguise had been his undoing. How was he to get out of this scrape, and with his pursuers just behind? "Let me explain," he began, and wondered what he could explain. "There's no time for explanations now, man. I tell you, the organ has begun the march. We're expected to be marching down that middle aisle this very minute, and Jeff is waiting for us in the chapel. I sent the signal to the bride and another to the organist the minute we sighted you. Come on. Everybody knows your boat was late coming in. You don't need to explain a thing till afterwards." At that moment, one of the ushers moved aside, and the short, thick-set man stepped between, the light shining full upon his face, and Gordon knew him positively for the man who had sat opposite him at the table a few minutes before. He was peering eagerly into the carriage door, and Gordon saw his only escape was into the church. With his heart pounding like a trip hammer, he yielded himself to the 6 ushers, who swept the little pursuer aside as if he had been a fly, and literally bore Gordon up the steps and into the church door. A burst of music filled his senses, and dazzling lights, glimpses of flowers, palms, and beautiful garments bewildered him. His one thought was for escape from his pursuers. Would they follow him into the church and drag him out in the presence of all these people, or would they be thrown off the track for a little while and give him opportunity yet to get away? He looked around wildly for a place of exit, but he was in the hands of the insistent ushers. One of them chattered to him in a low, growling whisper, such as men use on solemn occasions. "It must have been rough on you being anxious like this about getting here. But never mind now. It'll go all right. Come on. Here's our cue, and there stands Jefferson over there. You and he go in with the minister, you know. The groom and the best man, you understand. They'll tell you when. Jeff has the ring all right, so you won't need to bother about that. There's absolutely nothing for you to do but stand where you're put and go out when the rest do. You needn't feel a bit nervous." Was it possible that these crazy people didn't recognize their mistake even yet, here in the bright light? Couldn't they see his mustache was stuck on and one eyebrow was crooked? Didn't they know their best man well enough to recognize his voice? Surely someone would discover the mistake soon. That man Jeff over there who was eyeing him so intently. He would be sure to know this was not his friend. Yet every minute that they continued to think so was a distinct gain for Gordon, puzzling his pursuers and giving himself time to think and plan and study his strange surroundings. And now they were drawing him forward, and a turn of his head gave him a vision of the stubbed head of the thick-set man peering in at the chapel door and watching him eagerly. He must fool him, if possible. "But I don't know anything about the arrangements," faltered Gordon, reflecting that the best man might not be very well known to the ushers, and perhaps he resembled him. It was not the first time he had been taken for another man, and with his present make-up and all, perhaps it was natural. Could he possibly hope to bluff it out for a few minutes until the ceremony was over, and then escape? It would, of course, be the best way imaginable to throw that impudent little man in the doorway off his track. If the real best man would only stay away long enough, it would not be a difficult part to play. The original man might turn up after he was gone and create a pleasant little mystery, but nobody would be injured thereby. All this passed through his mind while the usher kept up his sepulchral whisper. "Why, there are just the usual arrangements, you know, nothing new. You and Jeff go in after the ushers have reached the back of the church and opened the door. Then you just stand there till Celia and her uncle come up the aisle. Then follows the ceremony, very brief. Celia had all that repeating after the minister cut out on account of not being able to rehearse. It's to be just the simplest service, not the usual lengthy affair. Don't worry. You'll be all right, old man. Hurry. They're calling you. Leave your hat right here. Now, I must go. Keep cool. It'll soon be over." The breathless usher hurried through the door and settled into a sort of exalted hobble to the time of the wonderful Lohengrin music. Gordon turned, thinking even yet to make a possible escape, but the eagle eye of his pursuer was upon him, and the man Jefferson was by his side. "Here we are," he said, eagerly grabbing Gordon's hat and coat and dumping them on a chair. "I'll look after everything. Just come along. It's time we went in. The doctor is motioning for us. Awfully glad to see you at last. Too bad you had to rush so. How many years is it since I saw you? 10? You've changed some, but you're looking fine and dandy. No need to worry about anything. It'll soon be over, and the knot tied." Mechanically, Gordon fell into place beside the man Jefferson, who was a pleasant-faced youth, well-groomed and handsome. Looking furtively at his finely cut, happy features, Gordon wondered if he would feel as glad as this youth seemed to be when he walked down the aisle to meet his bride. How, by the way, would he feel if he were going to be married now, going into the face of this great company of well-dressed people to meet Miss Julia Bentley and be joined to her for life? Instinctively his soul shrank within him at the thought. But now the door was wide open, the organ pealing its best, and he suddenly became aware of many eyes, and of wondering how long his eyebrows would withstand the perspiration that was trickling softly down his forehead. His mustache, ridiculous appendage, why had he not removed it? Was it awry? Dared he put up his hand to see? His gloves! Would anyone notice that they were not as strictly fresh as a best man's gloves should be? Then he took his first step to the music, and it was like being pulled from a delicious morning nap and plunged into a tub of icy water. He walked with feet that suddenly weighed like lead across a church that looked to be miles in width, in the face of swarms of curious eyes. He tried to reflect that these people were all strangers to him, that they were not looking at him anyway, but at the bridegroom by his side, and that it mattered very little what he did, so long as he kept still and braved it out. If only the real best man didn't turn up until he was well out of the church. Then he could vanish in the dark and go by some back way to a car or a taxicab, and so to the station. The thought of the paper inside the gold pencil case filled him with a sort of elation. If only he could get out of this dreadful church, he would probably get away safely. Perhaps even the incident of the wedding might prove to be his protection, for they would never seek him in a crowded church at a fashionable wedding. The man by his side managed him admirably, giving him a whispered hint, a shove or a push now and then, and getting him into the proper position. It seemed as if the best man had to occupy the most trying spot in all the church, but as they put him there, of course it was right. He glanced furtively over the faces near the front, and they all looked quite satisfied, as if everything were going as it should. So he settled down to his fate, his white, strained face partly hidden by the abundant display of mustache and eyebrow. People whispered softly how handsome he looked, and some suggested that he was not so stout as when they had last seen him 10 years before. His stay in a foreign land must have done him good. One woman went so far as to tell her daughter that he was far more distinguished looking than she had ever thought he could become. But it was wonderful what a stay in a foreign land would do to improve a person. The music stole onward, and slowly, gracefully, like the opening of buds into flowers, the bridal party inched along up the middle aisle, until at last the bride, in all the mystery of her white veil, arrived, and all the maidens in their flowers and many-colored gauzes were suitably disposed about her. The feeble old man, on whose arm the bride had leaned as she came up the aisle, dropped out of the procession, melting into one of the front seats, and Gordon found himself standing beside the bride. He felt sure there must be something wrong about it, and looked at his young guide with an attempt to change places with him, but the man named Jefferson held him in place with a warning eye. "You're all right. Just stay where you are," he whispered softly, and Gordon stayed, reflecting on the strange fashions of weddings, and wondering why he had never before taken notice of just how a wedding party came in and stood, and got out again. If he was only out of this, how glad he would be. It seemed one had to be a pretty all-round man to be a member of the Secret Service. The organ had hushed its voice to a sort of exultant sobbing, filled with dreams of flowers and joys, and hints of sorrow, and the minister, in a voice both impressive and musical, began the ceremony. Gordon stood doggedly and wondered if that really was one eyebrow coming down over his eye, or only a drop of perspiration. Another full second passed, and he decided that if he ever got out of this situation alive, he would never get married himself. During the next second that crawled by, he became supremely conscious of the creature in white by his side. A desire possessed him to look at her and see if she were like Julia Bentley. It was like a nightmare haunting his dreams that she was Julia Bentley, somehow transported to New York and being married to him willy-nilly. He could not shake it off, and the other eyebrow began to feel shaky. He was sure it was sailing down over his eye. If he only dared press the adhesive lining a little tighter to his flesh. Sometime during this situation there came a prayer interminable to his excited imagination, as all the other ceremonies. Under cover of the hush and the supposedly bowed heads, Gordon turned desperately toward the bride. He must see her and drive this phantasm from his brain. He turned, half expecting to see Julia's tall, handsome form, though telling himself he was a fool and wondering why he so dreaded the idea. Then his gaze was held fascinated. She was a little creature, slender and young and very beautiful, with a beauty which a deathly pallor only enhanced. Her face was delicately cut and set in a frame of fine dark hair, the whole made most exquisite by the mist of white tulle that breathed itself about her like real mist over a flower. But the lovely head drooped, the coral lips had a look of unutterable sadness, and the long lashes swept over white cheeks. He could not take his eyes from her now that he had looked. How lovely, and how fitting for the delightful youth by his side. Now that he thought of it, she was like him, only smaller and more delicate, of course. A sudden, fierce, ridiculous feeling of envy filled Gordon's heart. Why couldn't he have known and loved a girl like that? Why had Julia Bentley been forever in his pathway as the girl laid out for his choice? He looked at her with such intensity that a couple of dear old sisters who listened to the prayer with their eyes wide open whispered one to the other, "Just see him look at her! How he must love her! Wasn't it beautiful that he should come right from the steamer to the church and never see her till now for the first time in 10 long years? It's so romantic." "Yes," whispered the other, "and I believe it will last. He looks at her that way. Only I do dislike that way of arranging the hair on his face. But then it's foreign, I suppose. He'll probably get over it if they stay in this country." A severe old lady in the seat in front turned a reprimanding chin toward them, and they subsided. Still Gordon continued to gaze. Then the bride became aware of his look, raised her eyes, and they were full of tears. They gave him one reproachful glance that shot through his soul like a sword, and her lashes drooped again. By some mysterious control over the law of gravity, the tears remained unshed, and the man's gaze was turned aside, but that look had done its mighty work. All the experiences of the day rushed over him, and seemed to culminate in that one look. It was as if the reproach of all things had come upon him. The hurt in the white dog's eyes had touched him. The perfect courage in the appeal of the child's eyes had called forth his deepest sympathy. But the tears of this exquisite woman wrung his heart. He saw now that the appeal of the dog and the child had been the opening wedge for the look of a woman which tore self from him and flung it at her feet for her to walk upon, and when the prayer was ended he found that he was trembling. He looked vindictively at the innocent youth beside him as the soft rustle of the audience and the little breath of relief from the bridal party betokened the next stage in the ceremony. What had this innocent-looking youth done to cause tears in those lovely eyes? Was she marrying him against her will? He was only a boy, anyway. What right had he to suppose he could care for a delicate creature like that? He was making her cry already, and he seemed to be utterly unconscious of it. What could be the matter? Gordon felt a desire to kick him. Then it occurred to him that inadvertently he might have been the cause of her tears. He, supposedly the best man, who had been late and held up the wedding, no knowing how long. Of course, it wasn't really his fault, but by proxy it was, for he now was masquerading as that unlucky best man, and she was very likely reproaching him for what she supposed was his stupidity. He had heard that women cried sometimes from vexation, disappointment, or excitement. Yet, in his heart of hearts, he could not set those tears, that look, down to so trivial a cause. They had reached his very soul, and he felt there was something deeper there than mere vexation. There had been bitter reproach for a deep wrong done. The glance had told him that. All the manhood in him rose to defend her against whoever had hurt her. He longed to get one more look into her eyes to make quite sure, and then, if there was still appeal there, his soul must answer it. For the moment, his commission, his ridiculous situation, the real peril to his life and trust were forgotten. The man Jefferson had produced a ring and was nudging him. It appeared that the best man had some part to play with that ring. He dimly remembered somewhere hearing that the best man must hand the ring to the bridegroom at the proper moment. But it was absurd for them to go through the farce of doing that when the bridegroom already held the golden circlet in his fingers. Why did he not step up like a man and put it upon the outstretched hand? That little white hand just in front of him there, so timidly held out with its gloved fingers tucked back, like a dove crept out from its covert unwillingly. But that Jefferson man still held out the ring stupidly to him, and evidently expected him to take it. Silly youth! There was nothing for it but to take it and hand it back, of course. He must do as he was told, and hasten that awful ceremony to its interminable close. He took the ring and held it out, but the young man did not take it again. Instead, he whispered, "Put it on her finger." Gordon frowned. Could he be hearing right? Why didn't the fellow put the ring on his own bride? If he were being married, he would knock any man down that dared to put his wife's wedding ring on for him. Could that be the silly custom now, to have the best man put the bride's ring on? How unutterably out of place! But he must not make a scene, of course. The little timid hand, so slender and white, came a shade nearer, as if to help, and the ring finger separated itself from the others. He looked at the smooth circlet. It seemed too tiny for any woman's finger. Then, reverently, he slipped it on, with a strange, inexpressible longing to touch the little hand. While he was thinking himself all kinds of a fool, and was enjoying one of his intermittent visions of Julia Bentley's expressive countenance interpolated on the present scene, a strange thing happened. There had been some low murmurs and motions, which he had not noticed because he thought his part of this very uncomfortable affair was about concluded, when lo and behold, the minister and the young man by his side both began fumbling for his hand, and among them they managed to bring it into position and place in its astonished grasp the little timid hand that he had just crowned with its ring. As his fingers closed over the bride's hand, there was such reverence, such tenderness in his touch, that the girl's eyes were raised once more to his face, this time with the conquered tears in retreat, but all the pain and appeal still there. He looked, and involuntarily he pressed her hand the closer, as if to promise aforetime whatever she would ask. Then, with her hand in his, and with the realization that they two were detached, as it were, from the rest of the wedding party, standing in a little center of their own, his senses came back to him, and he perceived, as in a flash of understanding, that it was they who were being married. There had been some terrible, unexplainable mistake, and he was stupidly standing in another man's place, taking life vows upon himself. The thing had passed from an adventure of little moment into a matter of life tragedy, 2 life tragedies perhaps. What should he do? With the question came the words, "I pronounce you husband and wife," and "Let no man put asunder." End of chapter 3.